welcome to the second workshop of the Harvard Data Science Initiative. My name is Francesca Dominici. I'm the director of the Harvard Data Science Initiative and professor of biostatistics, population, and data science at the Harvard THN School of Public Health. So this afternoon workshop is on artificial intelligence in medicine. And it's really my great pleasure to introduce you to Andy Bean, who is going to be the leading faculty for this afternoon workshop. Andy is an assistant professor in epidemiology at the HSPH, at the Harvard THN School of Public Health, with a joint appointment at Harvard Medical School. Notably, Andy is one of the founding editor of the New England Journal of Medicine and AI. He's an expert in machine learning for better medical decision making. So thank you, Andy, for agreeing to lead this workshop.
Thanks, Francesca. So I'm super excited about this workshop. Like maybe slight program change. We're not going to be restricting this to AI in medicine. This is going to be AI broadly. And I wanted to just say a few reasons about the motivation for this workshop. So I'm a longtime AI nerd. I think most people who know me know that well. As an undergrad, I started reading all these books written by people like Doug Hofstadter, Derek Parfit, and even like Ray Kurzweil. Yes, I'll cop to that. And got really excited about AI. However, like when Francesca asked me about leading a workshop in AI, it occurred to me that like my professional life is very different than what thinking about AI was like as an undergrad. And specifically, what we do a lot is state-of-the-art leaderboard chasing. So we'll talk about some new state-of-the-art result on a benchmark, or we'll talk about how many parameters does the newest large language model have. And what I have this seeking feeling that we're sort of missing the forest for the trees. And so what I wanted to do in this workshop was kind of pull back a little bit and sort of re-examine some of those big questions that are at the heart of AI. So what I've asked each speaker to do is to take head on one of these big questions. And I hope that we're doing this at like a semi-serious level, like a slightly elevated dorm room conversation is what I'm hoping for here. And I'm going to ask everyone to hold their questions to the end. We're going to have an interactive panel at the end of the workshop where you can ask the speakers questions. I will ask them questions and hopefully get some clarity or get to the bottom of some of these big questions that are like actually some of the most exciting questions that we can be asking. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sam Gersman, who received his BA in Neuroscience and Behavior from Columbia University and his PhD in Psychology and Neuroscience from Princeton University in 2013. From 2013 to 2015, he was a postdoc in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science at MIT. He's currently a professor in the Department of Psychology and Center for Brain Science at Harvard. His research focuses on computational cognitive neuroscience approaches to learning, memory, and decision-making. So the question that I've given Sam is, to what extent do current approaches in AI mirror those in human intelligence? So Sam, welcome.
Thank you. I got this. All right. Wow, Andy, I'm so pleased to know that you like Derek Parfit. We could have a whole other workshop about that. So I don't work on AI in medicine, but I hope that some of the ideas that I'm going to bring up today maybe are relevant for questions there. And I agree, like, we're going to kind of pull back from the trees and look at the forest here. Okay. Looking. All right. So let me frame the big picture questions that I want to talk about today, and we'll have to kind of cover them superficially, but hopefully we can get deeper into them in the discussion. So I'm a cognitive scientist. I'm interested in human intelligence, and one of the reasons I'm here is that I'm interested in how we could formalize human intelligence at the level of precision that would be required to implement some model of human intelligence in a computer. And in that sense, right, my goals are similar to the goals of many people working in AI, which is that I want some kind of model of intelligence that will do intelligent things, right? But I have some constraints that are a little bit different from a lot of the constraints that are imposed on AI researchers, in the sense that I'm not really doing the leaderboard chasing, right? So my constraints are I want the machines to exhibit not just human level performance, right, but human-like performance, right? We care about are the machines doing things in the same way that humans are, solving problems in similar ways? And that requires different kinds of methods to understand what they're doing. And I'm not going to get into all of that in this short talk, but what I first want to do is just tell you a little bit about what we understand about what makes humans smart at a high level, and then think about how we can use that knowledge to build better AI, potentially by studying humans. And then I want to come to, I think, maybe what is the most speculative and potentially controversial part of the talk, which is I want to introduce what I'll call the problem, or we could sometimes call it the hard problem of AI for science, which is the problem of building AI agents that actually invent their own problems. Okay, and I'm going to discuss why that is so hard. Oops. Okay, so a few years ago, I wrote this book, What Makes Us Smart, and it was an attempt to articulate some of the principles of what makes us smart, human intelligence. And, but I was particularly motivated by this observation that if you walk into a bookstore and you go to the psychology section, you'll see all these books which seem to be conveying the message that humans are pretty dumb, right? So it's a little bit perverse then to write a book about how smart people are when people are actually dumb, right? So I had a little bit of legwork to do there, right? So just to put a bit more detail on that, right? So the catalog of human errors is vast. We perceive things that aren't there and fail to perceive things that are right in front of us. We forget things that happened and remember things that didn't. We say things we don't mean. We mean things we don't say. We're inconsistent, myopic, overly optimistic, biased, right? And yet, you can still go into journals and find articles like this. Motion illusions as optimal percepts, a rational analysis of the selection task as optimal data selection. So you see a lot as optimal, rational, and so on. Right? So how can we be both really dumb and biased and all of that, right? And also almost optimal and rational and so on, right? What's going on here? How do you reconcile these points of view? And the way that I try to reconcile this paradox is by pointing out that to be optimal, you actually have to make errors, okay? And that's not entirely intuitive to a lot of people. And basically, the book tries to unpack what I mean by this. But just to give you a little bit more information, so errors, right? The definition of an error is that you're doing something or perceiving something that's wrong relative to the ground truth, right? But of course, the brain doesn't have access to the ground truth, and the same goes for AI systems, right? So we're always in the position of having to estimate things or do things approximately. And with that in mind, right, errors arise in two ways. So one is some kind of systematic bias, and another is noise due to for example, some kind of approximation error. And I argue that both are indispensable for intelligence, and that in fact you cannot build an intelligent machine or understand human intelligence without understanding the nature of these errors. So what are the actual problems? What are the source of the errors that people make? So one is that we have limited data. So we need to make inductive generalizations based on a finite number of examples. And this requires what's sometimes called an inductive bias, right? Some constraint or preference over possible hypotheses before you've seen the data. And then there's limited computation. So we need to do all of our thinking with an energy budget that's comparable to a light bulb. So think about that next time you use your big computing center. And this requires approximation, right? And that's going to introduce both bias and noise. So just focusing on the inductive bias part of things, it's been shown in various ways that truly general intelligence is impossible in the sense that it is not possible to construct a machine that does equally well on all possible problems, okay? And one way of thinking about what that means is that in order to build a machine that does well on some subset of those problems, you need to impose some inductive bias that makes the machine basically have some understanding of the structure of the problem space before it gets applied to it. So let me just give you an example of this, right? So I show you 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. What comes next, right? Most of you would say 12, right? But why, right? It could be anything, right? It could be negative 100, right? And there's no way for you to say with certainty what comes next based on this finite sample. And this is just a thought experiment, but we've done many studies of this sort, right, to show that people have strong inductive biases about patterns in the world that they're trying to learn about. I'm going to come back at the end to how we should think about these inductive biases over patterns. Okay, but the point here is that this idea of the impossibility of truly general intelligence has been formalized in a number of ways in machine learning, and what these theorems imply is that any effective learning system has to be able to learn some things more easily than others, right? And that's true of humans, and it's true of machines. So another example that I like to motivate this is the Ponzo illusion. So why is it that we see this line as longer than this line, even though they're actually the same length? And I think to answer this question, we have to pop out of thinking about visual illusions as errors full stop and thinking about what is actually the computational problem being solved by our visual system here, right? In general, we're not interpreting two-dimensional pictures as two-dimensional pictures. We're trying to make an inference about the three-dimensional world, and that's actually an ill-posed problem, right? Because your retina gets this two-dimensional picture, basically, right? And many different three-dimensional worlds can project onto the same two-dimensional picture. So it's an ambiguous inferential problem, okay? And that means that we need some inductive bias about what kinds of structures exist in the world in order to resolve that ambiguity, but it also means that sometimes we'll make mistakes. All right, so here's the challenge for AI. If we want to make human-like machines, we need human-like inductive biases, and that means we need to understand what those inductive biases are, right? Now, I want to say right away that maybe we don't want to make human-like machines, right? And I think that's a completely valid position. So we have to kind of decide in any application area, to what extent do we actually care about making human-like machines? Like for some of the things that the other panelists are going to talk about, maybe that shouldn't be our goal, or maybe that's kind of a distraction, right? But then there are other cases where we think about the successes of human scientists and the kinds of things that human scientists do well that we don't yet know how to replicate in machines. Maybe that's a place where we want to think more about how humans think. Okay. So I want to conjecture that some of the current gaps between human and machine intelligence arise from differences in inductive bias, that we haven't figured out how to program our AI systems with the same kinds of inductive biases that humans have, right? And that's just an empirical program of research that we could pursue. So let me just tell you a little bit about some of the things that we know about inductive biases, and I'll categorize the human inductive biases. I'll categorize those into two kinds of inductive biases. One class is intuitive theories. So we build intuitive theories of domains comparable, at least in structure, to how professional scientists build theories of domains, right? So a professional scientist might build a sophisticated theory of physics, right? A physical domain, right? And humans have their own intuitive physics. It's obviously not as sophisticated as a professional physicist is, but it has some things in common. So there's a lot of work suggesting that the human brain and also animal brains have something approximating a Newtonian physics engine in their head so that they can extrapolate object motions, for example. Right, so that's a claim about the intuitive theory that the brain has access to about the physical domain. And there's analogous intuitive theories for psychology, understanding other agents, as well as other domains. And then so those are intuitive theories. There are also domain general structural constraints, right? So they don't apply to any specific domain, but they apply to many different domains. So for example, the idea of compositionality, that you can build complex structures out of simpler ones, or learning to learn in causality. And I'll say a bit about that. All right, so just to give you an example of intuitive physics, right, we can look at these pictures and immediately have a sense of the physical stability of these configurations, what might happen if we apply a force to them, right? Where are the billiard balls going to go, right? We can extract a lot of this information from this relatively impoverished source of data, and we do that because we have strong inductive biases about the physical domain. And this has been studied quite extensively. Some of the work has been done here at Harvard. Already in the first few months of life, infants understand the notion of cohesion, that objects move as connected and bounded wholes. They move on connected paths. That objects don't interact at a distance. And then slightly later, they get concepts of inertia, support, containment, collisions, right? So this all suggests that infants aren't learning physics from scratch. They're endowed with a lot of physical inductive biases already from a young age, possibly even at birth. And the benefits if we think about this from a machine learning point of view, is that we have reduced sample complexity because in some sense evolution has done some of the learning for us already, and the baby's just ready to go with physics, right? And it helps babies do deeper generalizations, right? Because babies and adults, they're constantly exposed to changes in appearance, like lighting changes, pose changes, and so on, right? And having a intuitive physical theory allows our physical understanding to be robust to those variations. And there are other advantages to generalization, like you can add a new object to a configuration and not have to, that won't just completely throw off your physics engine. So intuitive psychology, again, from a very young age, pre-verbal infants have notions of what other agents are and how they expect them to behave. Like they expect infants to take efficient actions to achieve goals, so they're not going to just randomly jump when there's no obstacle blocking them. They can even discriminate helpers from hinderers. So, another agent that's helping push another agent up a hill versus pushing it down deviously. So those are intuitive theories. Let me say a few words about the structural inductive biases. So compositionality shows up in lots of different forms. Here are just two. Here's an example, an old example from the 80s, thinking about compositional structural descriptions of things like a body, where you can decompose the whole body into a nested subset of configurations. And then there are more ambitious programs of trying to think about how we can build up graphs from a graph grammar and use that to understand how humans understand all sorts of different kinds of data. Like you give humans information about features of different animals, and they can figure out that the correct topology of those objects corresponds to a tree, something approximating a phylogenetic tree. But if you give them, let's say, Supreme Court judge voting patterns, they figure out that the correct topology is something like a line from like conservative to liberal. And compositionality is really useful for the idea of learning to learn, where you can learn something from a set of from one set of problems and then generalize it to allow you to learn faster on a new problem. Because once you've decomposed some complex objects into their primitives and their relations, you can recompose them in new ways to learn more efficiently. Okay, so now I get to the last part, and this is maybe the juiciest part, okay? And the part that I myself am the least sure about, and maybe the most fun to discuss. Okay, so here's the problem. To set the stage, we're at a really exciting point now where we have AI tools, and I'm using AlphaFold as an example, but the other panelists have been pioneers in doing this kind of work. We have tools where we can solve scientific problems at scale in problems that were previously only penetrable by human ingenuity. Okay, and so we have many recent successes. Doing 3D structure prediction from protein sequences is just one example. Okay, but if you think about most of these applications, right, what is going on there? Well, essentially what's going on there is we have a well-defined optimization problem, and the thing that AI is bringing to the table is really good optimization tools, okay, with function approximation and all of that kind of stuff, right? The breakthroughs arise from the design of powerful optimization techniques. I'm arguing, right? And maybe the other panelists will disabuse me of that notion. Okay, but so where does the problem specification come from in the first place, right? Currently, it comes from humans, right? The AI system is handed the optimization problem, right? Or in fact, the AI system is designed to solve a particular optimization problem, okay? So this is the problem, right? It's the challenge of designing algorithms that invent their own problems. Okay? And in some sense, that's what we're looking for when we design a fully functional AI scientist. It's the scientist that doesn't just go solve a particular problem that their advisor handed them. It's like when you advise. Actually, I'll come back to that in a second. But I first want to just motivate this a little bit more. So if you think about a scientist like Albert Einstein, obviously not everyone's going to be at the level of Albert Einstein, but like, what was special about him? Did he have a really good version of backprop in his brain? I don't think that was his secret. Okay, right? I will submit to you that great scientists aren't extraordinary optimizers of ordinary optimization problems, but they are ordinary optimizers of extraordinary optimization problems. And that's actually one of the things that Francis Crick pointed out, that there was nothing really special about him and Watson. I mean, we could debate that, right? But he said that what was special was the nature of the problem. Like, they were sort of in the right place at the right time, solving this problem. They had good taste in picking their problem, right? But they weren't like the computations going on in their brain weren't special relative to any of the other scientists-related problems. Okay, so we can think about this as a kind of outer loop, or one way you might approach it naively, right, is a kind of outer loop optimization. Can we take this problem and turn it into another optimization problem, right? All right, so maybe. So we could try to write down the outer loop optimization where we have like an undifferentiated mess, and you define an optimization problem where the problem is basically to spit out a problem, okay? So how do you do that, right? So the typical machine learning setting would be to do some kind of supervised thing, or maybe some reinforcement learning thing, like the PhD advisor gets all his or her grad students to come and there's good job, bad job, good job, bad job, and then you get a lot of training data that way. But I think I would think that you're going to get too few good examples that way, right? Like, how would we actually build that kind of training setup? And then more fundamentally, who chooses what the good examples are? Like, what are actually the principles of good examples? This is actually true of a lot of things in human in the loop, like the kinds of reinforcement learning from human feedback that drives large language models. We basically outsourced certain kinds of problematic conceptual definitions to humans to solve implicitly, and that's sort of conceding that the engineers don't know how to solve those problems, right? And so until we do, we're going to still be stuck with humans doing certain things. And I mean, maybe to draw really far back, right? There is a kind of, this comes down to a kind of really fundamental issue. Like, all of you are good data scientists, and you're good at like running your clustering algorithm or your dimensionality reduction algorithm, right? And you do that because you're trying to find structure in your data. You're trying to identify patterns, right? What makes a good pattern, right? That is not a machine learning problem in a certain sense, right? Because when you apply a clustering algorithm, or even when you like write down a clustering algorithm, you're actually assuming some things implicitly or explicitly about what makes a good pattern, right? So I could, like in the case of clustering, right, I could define a generative model. I could say, well, my data is generated from a Gaussian mixture model, and now it becomes a statistical estimation problem to find the underlying clusters. But fundamentally, right, you've built into the definition of the generative model your assumptions about what kinds of patterns you think are relevant to you. Not just what kinds of patterns are there, but like what kinds of patterns are you trying to discover in the data. And so this is a really fundamental problem. It's difficult to even think about how you define that as a machine learning problem, right? Because it really comes down to something like something in human psychology and maybe sociology. Like, we are all part of a culture that has defined certain kinds of patterns as interesting or important, right? So I'm almost done here. Right? If we want to create a true AI scientist, something more than a tool, it's more like training a first-year PhD student, right? And for those of you who have experience either as a first-year PhD student or as an advisor of a first-year PhD student, that it's a lot more like giving them a kind of a taste and an intuition, right? So you're not just giving them optimization problems, or at least not ideally. You're teaching them what kinds of patterns are interesting, important, beautiful, puzzling. We're kind of programming constraints on the optimization problem into the student's brain, rather than handing them optimization problems. So my postdoc and I, Rory Battleday, have been thinking about this through the lens of history. And we've actually been, much to my surprise, writing a book about Antoine Lavoisier and 18th century chemistry, which is not something I thought I'd be doing a year ago. But it's a really nice case study of scientific breakthroughs and trying to understand what were the cognitive processes going on in Lavoisier's head to the extent that we can reconstruct them. What can we learn about building a system that could actually automate something like that? And then from the perspective of cognitive science, what can we learn by creating laboratory analogs of science to study how people invent problems, right? So we want, and in particular, there is a whole history to this, right? But without going into all the details of that history, I would say that what we're trying to do is move away from the setting of here's a problem, how do you solve it? There's a lot of work on that in human cognitive science, to more like here's a domain, how do you make sense of it, right? And this sense-making activity is fundamentally ontological. It's sort of this question of what's out there and also sort of what's interesting, beautiful, important, puzzling, and so on. How am I doing on time? Do I need to stop? Okay, I have like 2 minutes. Okay, yeah. Okay.
These are soft recommendations for it.
I'm very close to being done. Okay. So I want to tell you one other thing about psychology. There's this very interesting book by the psychologist Frank Kyle that was published in the 1970s. And he called attention to the following kind of phenomenon. He was interested in cognitive development, so in children, but the same points apply to adults. So I tell you the cow is green. Okay, that's wrong, but it's sensical, right? A cow could, in principle, be green. You could imagine a possible world in which cows are green, but in this world, cows are not green. Okay, the cow was an hour long. That's not even wrong, right? It's nonsensical, okay? And maybe a more formal way of saying this is that the predicate, an hour long, is not applicable to the object cow, okay? Now, somehow, in our brains, we have these sorts of predicability constraints that characterize our domain of knowledge. All right, and these constraints are going to strongly govern what kinds of theories we arrive at when we're looking at interactions between objects in a domain. And so it seems to me that what you really want to do if you want to build an AI scientist that thinks like a human scientist is understand this, right? Because this is a powerful structural inductive bias that basically eliminates certain kinds of theories from consideration in the first place, right? And this is something that we don't understand, really. And certainly the kinds of AI systems that we're building now, I would argue, don't have these kinds of predicability constraints. Okay, so I don't really have conclusions. I'll say in lieu of conclusions, I will just recap what I said. So what makes us smart? I argue that human intelligence is at least partly explained by inductive bias, which is a combination of intuitive theories and structural constraints. I didn't get into all the algorithmic approximations that the brain has to use. And I put out this conjecture that some of the current gaps between human and machine intelligence arise from differences in inductive bias. So it gives us something to think about if we want to close those gaps. And here's the biggest gap of all. It's the problem, how to invent problems. How do we basically get Lavoisier in the loop? Okay, thank you for listening.
So Marinka Zitnik is an assistant professor at Harvard in the Department of Biomedical Informatics, with additional appointments at the Kempner Institute and the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Dr. Zitnik investigates the foundations of AI to enhance scientific discovery and to realize individualized diagnosis and treatment. She founded the Therapeutics Data Commons, a global open science AI foundation to advance therapeutic science, and is also faculty and lead of the AI for Science initiative. So Marinka's question, which I think Sam did a great job of teeing up, is when will the first discovery made solely by an AI system happen?
Great. Thanks so much, Andy, for this kind introduction and for organizing this workshop. I really enjoyed the previous talk, and somehow it relates so much to what I was thinking about as well. So the prompt for myself, for me, was when will the first major scientific discovery be made solely by AI really happen? And so, let me walk you through some of my thoughts on developing and building the idea of AI scientists, where we currently stand. I will squeeze in an example from my research, which is focused around AI for medicine as well, so which will justify the name of the workshop, and then the title of the workshop, and then conclude with some of my thoughts. Okay, great. So let's begin. So for centuries, the method of discovery, which is these fundamental scientific principles that scientists use to understand the world logically and systematically, has in some way remained the same. And so the exciting opportunity around AI and related emerging technologies is that they might help us completely rethink or redesign the way science is being done. And we are indeed seeing that AI increasingly is used across scientific disciplines. It is used to help with integration, generation of data, and collecting various measurements, then formulating scientific hypotheses that can guide experiments and explore the space of theories that would be compatible with the data that was collected, and finally using AI in order to refine those hypotheses through a cycle of continual improvement. And really, what we are seeing is that the impact of AI on scientific research today can be seen in two different ways. So first is that generative AI in particular is already playing a role in the way we go about doing our everyday scientific activities. And in particular, in a recent Nature poll, we asked 1,600 researchers around the world about their views on the rise of AI in science, including ML, generative AI, and other methods. And among those who responded, they said that 27% of them said that they see the role of AI being crucial in their own field of research. And that includes scientists whose main area of research is not necessarily computer science, machine learning, or AI. And another 47% of them responded that in the next decade, the expectation is that AI will become and play a very important role in their area of research. And we are seeing that how is it being used nowadays? It's being used to help with augmenting scientific ideas, brainstorming, drafting documents, serving as a way to augment scientific search engines. The second important impact that I'm actually more excited about on how that AI has on scientific research is that increasingly we are seeing in various areas of domains that AI can augment research and provide insights that would not be possible using traditional scientific methods alone. And there are examples of that ranging from AlphaFold to examples in physics and mathematics where AI can help generate hypotheses or help with the work scientists do at the time scales or levels that otherwise just would not be possible using traditional approaches. So there's been just lots of excitement and enthusiasm and questions in the AI community at the interface of scientific discovery, whether we can develop now with these new advances in AI, this notion of AI scientists, which would be some ecosystem of tools or agents coordinated by LLMs that would be capable of skeptical learning and capable of skeptical reasoning. This is a question that is actually not new. In fact, there has been quite a number of years already that this idea of building autonomous AI systems that are capable of learning and reasoning has been discussed. In particular, in early October, as the Nobel Foundation announced the recipients of this year's Nobel Prizes, a group of researchers, including previous laureates, met in Stockholm, and they discussed how AI might have or already have an increasingly creative role in scientific process. And the main question for them was, when will AI models and systems be able to produce world-class science? And so world-class science, what does world-class science mean? And so they came up with this idea that they refer to as Nobel Turing Challenge. And the idea is, and the hypothesis was that this autonomous AI system might potentially will have the potential to make Nobel-worthy discoveries by 2050. Right? So that happened 2 years ago, this idea of Nobel Turing Challenge. And so what we are seeing now with the advancements in LLMs and various other kinds of foundation models, there is this renewed enthusiasm about the possibility of building more capable, broader autonomous systems that might realize the idea of AI scientists and really produce world-class new discoveries. So I think there are some reasons and advances that could perhaps in general confirm that we are at the inflection point where we can start thinking about whether building an AI scientist can be feasible. So I can offer three kind of reasons for that. So first is what we are seeing is that chat-optimized large language models such as GPT-4 and related models now increasingly can incorporate feedback. They can cooperate with other large language models. They can cooperate with other tools. They can cooperate potentially with other experimental platforms. and have a dialogue, have a discussion, and kind of build this ecosystem which is of collaborative nature that involves human partners, involves experimental platforms, and includes large language models that are coordinating different kinds of activities. So this is a very appealing way of how one can think about going after a much bigger, broader question and decomposing it into simpler tasks that this agent system will solve, and then composing these answers to those simple tasks back into an answer to a very big problem. And we have seen that this idea of creating large language models powered AI agents can really solve certain complex tasks when those are broken in simpler tasks. However, on the other end, what current AI models for scientific discovery mainly look like specialized models that scientists with incredible amount of domain expertise and knowledge designed to solve a specific task, and they use them for a specific task. So while in principle, we would like to have AI agents that would just broadly coordinate many different models together with experimental platforms, the predominant approach today is still to build specialized models for specialized questions that are a priori defined. And so generally, these methods are still limited to low throughput experiments, and they lack some of the physical scientific reasoning. And so AlphaFold is a model of that kind. Incredibly impressive, incredibly important advance for structural biology and biology more broadly. But at the end of the day, this is an algorithm and a model architecture that was handcrafted by scientists who had expertise of biology and chemistry, and working together with scientists who have expertise in fundamental machine learning model architectural design. And they incorporated this prior scientific knowledge, which was so nicely articulated and described as inductive biases, into that specific algorithm. So what are examples of those inductive biases that are in AlphaFold? Those are examples include information about valid protein folding angles, about certain electrochemical properties or assertions that the structured proteins the three-dimensional structure of proteins should obey, and that guided the algorithm towards generating the structure of proteins that more likely captures the reality of biology and chemistry. So what the challenge is that current methods really do not automatically identify those inductive biases. And why is this so important? Because having this predefined notion of what are just a space of possible solutions is so relevant for reducing the size of hypothesis space that need to be examined and through which the models and human scientists need to navigate, and potentially also reduce the cost associated with actually generating experiments in the lab. So do large language models then bring us closer to AI systems that would be capable of making novel-worthy discoveries? On one end, we are very enthusiastic about all the advances that we are seeing in LLMs and kind of combinations of LLMs in the form of agent systems. But on the other end, there seems like there are things that are missing, right? So imagine or suppose that we want to implement the AI scientists using the tools and algorithms that are available to us today. So suppose we follow this conventional approach to foundation models that rely on large language models on other type of large pre-trained models. So I would argue that in that case, we might actually fail to develop AI scientists as autonomous systems that could generate really novel hypotheses. And this is because in many ways, defining what a novel, interesting, valid, exciting hypothesis is something that's not easily encountered or defined in the data sets that these models are trained on. For example, using LLMs as a comparison, generating novel hypotheses requires some notion of creativity. But generating novel text, such as using ChatGPT, requires semantic, syntactic conformance. So what that means is that for generating novel text, perhaps optimizing large language models through this idea of auto-completion or masking the next token and then predicting the identity is actually a good strategy. But for generating novel, interesting, exciting hypotheses, which are at the core of world-class science, it's not obvious that that is the right optimization strategy that we're using for foundation models predominantly nowadays. So there are some components that are kind of clearly missing. And I would say, well, there are many of them, but I will just mention 3 broad components that we're currently need to develop further in order to start potentially implementing pilot versions or mini versions of AI scientists. So first is that of thinking about potentially really larger agent systems as ecosystems of tools. So scientists don't generally work in isolation, but they work in research teams. And so research teams have experts with different kinds of backgrounds and different kinds of expertise. The closer towards that idea in AI and ML, we get with this idea of having an ecosystem of AI agents where every AI agent is an LLM, an ML model, experimental platform, or a human scientist, and they collaborate together. Second is, an important component that we're missing is that of having models that have the ability of some form of divergent reasoning while considering facts, while being grounded in reality and what constraints are imposed by the physics or the chemistry or the biology of the problem, and being creative in some way. And so those are all critical components for world-class science. And finally, what I would argue we need is general approaches for evaluation, and by that I don't necessarily mean additional leaderboards that we would and benchmarks that we would chase, but some notion of defining what does potentially a discovery made by an AI model really mean, and what is autonomous discovery in particular relative to being discovery made in assistance or collaboration with humans. Okay, so I would argue that autonomous AI scientist system need to be creative. It needs to be skeptical when developing scientific hypotheses. How would that look like? I think of this kind of AI scientist process in the form of 3 big steps. Step 1 would be identify what kind of inductive biases are most helpful, right? And this really connects well to the first presentation, which was this is the problem kind of question. Automatically find what inductive biases are most helpful for a specific scientific discipline in order to reduce the search space of hypotheses, reduce the cost of experiments. And once we have that mechanism of in identifying appropriate inductive biases, can we then generate scientific hypotheses that that take those inductive biases into consideration and effectively rank order them. And how do we want to rank order them? Well, we want those hypotheses that are creative, novel, potentially breakthrough ideas, and also hypotheses that have somewhat that we can actually test, that have manageable, reasonable experimental cost. So the second important step would be the AI scientist would need to apply its skepticism through techniques that quantify uncertainty in order to identify which of those hypotheses is most valuable and how to perform experiments in reference to the original hypothesis that perhaps the model initially started with and then refined through multiple steps of iteration. And finally, this process is iterative or continually evolving and self-improving in the sense of hypotheses need to be refined based on the knowledge and based on the insights and measurements generated by experiments, as well as the counter examples that come from experiments that were made to generate a hypothesis. So I would argue that we're still quite far away from having these kind of systems, which currently even high-capacity AI models can, once the inductive bias is appropriately defined, only under human guidance and effectively monitoring as well as interaction, they can generate hypotheses, but then it's still on human scientists to be able to determine the value of a specific hypothesis and then define which is the one that they would proceed into the next stage of scientific discovery. So let me make one step back now and give an example of what I would think of as state-of-the-art AI models for medicine as an illustration from my work so that you will see how far away we are from really having AI scientists that would be able to identify inductive biases and go about performing the experiments in a kind of self-driving lab sense And while that is our vision, including the vision of my lab and many other labs, the reality of scientific discovery and the integration of AI into the scientific discovery is kind of quite far from this broad vision that we are following. But so the vision of my group is specifically to lay foundations of AI. We are very interested in using AI to enhance scientific understanding of medicine and support the development of safer and effective therapeutics. And our eye is on eventually enabling AI to learn and innovate on its own in a more self-improving continual manner. And so while that is our vision, the reality is often that we need to define inductive biases and train large foundation models to kind of enable interesting, exciting predictions. So let me kind of spend perhaps the next couple of minutes walking you through one of the recent projects that I think is quite exciting in the group that we have done. And so specifically, my group is very interested in large language models and this idea of using the models, these large language models, to be able to model more accurately, more precisely biological sequences. So what that means is that we're not so much interested in training large language models on natural text in human languages, but really training those large language models on biological sequences of amino acid sequences or nucleotide sequences. So the question that we ask in the group is, well, is natural language and processing of natural language the same as processing biological language, so the language of life? Can we simply take those large language models that were developed for processing of English and other languages and simply retrain them using the exact same kind of inductive biases on biological sequences? And so to answer this question, the first thing that we have done is that we looked at a broad range of around 77 different natural language-based large language models. And we asked the question of, going through those models, what kind of inductive biases in specific, those models implement, and how are those biases can be studied in the context of the structure of the latent space that those models generate. And so what constraints specifically do these large pre-trained language models impose on geometry between different embeddings that they produce for the input data set of samples, which regularly would be words or sentences or tokens, but in our case it would be sequences of amino acids, of proteins, or other types of molecules. And what we found is that, well, most NLP-derived pre-training models really do not impose these explicit deep constraints that we care about in biology, where we care about not only relationships that exist within each sequence, but also relationships that exist between different samples or sequences, which are relationships between proteins, which are really important to understand because they drive molecular interactions that then influence so many other important biological processes. So what we wanted to do is to augment these large language models so that they would consider for every sequence, which is in our case a protein, the structure, the internal structure, or in patterns that exist within that amino acid sequence of a protein, but then also the relationships and the structure that exists when we compare multiple proteins to each other. And so the way we approach that is to develop a framework. We refer to it as structure-inducing pre-training framework that has two big components. And the first is that the first component is having a large pre-training data set of sequences. And every sequence is a protein, and for a protein we have its amino acid sequence. In addition to that, we have a pre-training graph, which is given us a graph or network of nodes, edges between them. Those nodes are samples, which in our case are proteins. And then proteins and these nodes are connected based on known physical interactions of those proteins. So the way this would look like in the case of the protein science and protein biology domain, the kind of the way you can conceptually think of this pre-training graph and data set is like this, where every node in the pre-training graph actually can be blow up and you see the three-dimensional structure of a protein, and there's an edge between two proteins if they kind of fit together as a lock and a key, and they would be in a physical context, which we refer to as protein-protein interaction. And so the way to jointly model both pre-training graph and pre-training data set together, what we have done is augment the language modeling, this objective, which is this masking objective. Let's hide a token and ask the model to predict the identity of the hidden token and do the auto-completion at the amino acid level, to also obey the relations between proteins encoded in the pre-training protein graph. And this is what we refer to as structure-inducing objective. So what we showed is that models in large language models trained on biological sequences, not trained on natural language and related domain, can really benefit from this additional inductive bias integrated into the model, so that when we turn off this pre-training graph and the associated structure-inducing objective, performance of the model in terms of predicting biological properties of proteins and related biomolecules can drop quite considerably relative to not using relative to not using the structure-inducing objective. Okay, so we of course benchmark this model very comprehensively, the way we following the established protocols across several data sets across different domains that entailed proteins, also to some extent literature information and abstracts describing those proteins and different kinds of molecular interactions. And across all those experiments, the model performed quite well, and we were very excited about strong performance of the model that showed the benefit of this additional inductive bias, helping biology and being relevant for biology as a domain, while not necessarily being particularly helpful or useful for natural language. But it's an example of how domain knowledge that a scientist working in a specific domain or area has can really help improve model performance quite considerably. And so what we are doing now is really integrating this structure-inducing pre-training model into a much larger agent-based multimodal generative language model that kind of schematically, conceptually works like what is shown here on the slide, where we can look at the model interpret it from left to right. So the way human scientists interact with this model is that they described a query of interest, which might be a biological phenotype or disease in their plain natural language, and they kind of also specify a starting amino acid sequence that they would like to understand how it relates to their phenotype of interest. And so both of these two inputs, which are multimodal because we have natural language and biological sequence, is then processed by a multimodal model, which has two big large language models. One is the natural language based, and the other is based on biological sequences. And kind of these two data modalities trained jointly then allow us to handle a broad range of tasks using very few additional training or adaptation of the model through zero-shot learning, few-shot learning, and prompting. And there are many exciting novel model capabilities that this model has. It can provide a more conversational approach towards biology and scientific discovery. It can it can annotate molecules with phenotypes that are not predefined or pre-exist in controlled vocabularies, which is this open vocabulary learning, which is important for discovering new phenotypes, new questions that are at the frontier of scientific discovery that have not yet been so clearly formulated and are so clearly present in ontologies and databases. And it has what we are all excited about, this zero-shot learning capability to some extent, where the model can make predictions around concepts, phenotypes, or the molecular structures that it never encountered before during training time. So this is an example of how we are leveraging and integrating, building on cutting-edge advances in LLMs in order to make AI models for biology and protein biology in particular a bit more expressive, more interactive, building this idea of bringing multiple partners together. Some of them are AI models, others are data sets and databases in order to build research teams that can then collaborate and have dialogues in more productive manner. Okay, the last few points, and so I'll kind of, the last few slides really relate to a bit more realistic set of challenges that I see the field of AI for science is working on actively. And those challenges really go beyond algorithmic challenges and algorithmic innovation, which is something that we have discussed quite a bit in this presentation and the previous one as well. And I would argue there are three kinds of grand challenges that we need to think about when we want to more closely integrate AI in scientific discovery. And so the first type of challenges are with respect to making our models better. The second are various practical aspects of assuming we have high-performing models, how we can use them in a productive manner. And second, what how has the conduct of science and more broadly scientific enterprise, how is it changing as a result of having large models, some having large compute, other institutions not having large compute resources and data sets to be able to benefit from these advances. So from the practical standpoint, I think that there are several important challenges that need to be considered that include the idea of data use and data reuse, in particular how data sets can be more readily available and standardized to scientists, how the use of AI models in scientific discovery today mostly guides this process of discovery, which is only half of the science, perhaps. The ultimate goal of science is understanding. So the question becomes how we can go from the discovery towards really understanding of new principles, which requires distilling those discoveries into more manageable, easily comprehensible new laws or concepts or mechanisms. That also includes questions related to implementation and reproducibility of these AI-based workflows in terms of building a new kind or new level of computational and AI infrastructure that is more readily accessible to broader scientific community. There are many algorithmic questions. So for those who are interested in developing new algorithms, I think that it's really a great opportunity to take motivations from sciences, from biology, from chemistry, physics, mathematics, and other scientific disciplines, and go and understand what are the challenges in those fields. And that can kind of really then create many opportunities for algorithmic innovation that go from multimodal learning, from causal learning, uncertainty quantification, knowledge-guided AI models. And finally, what I think is very important and looking forward to the future, I see that the demand for AI expertise will largely be influenced by two forces. So first is the existence of problems that are on the verge of benefiting from applications in AI, such as self-driving labs. And what are those problems that are on the verge of benefiting from AI, for which we have sufficient amount of data to train models, some notion of measure of success so that outputs can be then acted upon, evaluated for their consideration. And second important factor that will influence the need for AI expertise is also the ability of these intelligent AI tools to enhance state-of-the-art and then create new opportunities, right? Such as examining biological processes or physical processes that happen at land or happen at timescales that simply are not accessible to today's experimental platforms. And I would expect that on the basis of these two factors, the composition of research teams in sciences will considerably change over the next years. It will include AI specialists, software, hardware engineers, novel forms of collaborations between governments, educational institutions, and corporations. Recent state-of-the-art models also are incredibly large in their model size, which creates important questions with respect to who can afford training and leveraging and using those models. And once those models are being developed and are released to the broader community, how do scientists who are not necessarily trained in the technical computer science and machine learning background apply those tools and use them productively towards their own research questions? So that will require kind of a development of new education programs that will be inherently interdisciplinary in nature. So just to conclude, I would argue that modern AI paradigms have already started to change how research is done, and they can impact on major scientific discovery in the future. I'm very excited about this idea of building multi-agent conversations and multi-agent systems that can help initially with automating some of more complex tasks and potentially doing much more. But there are many ethical, legal considerations that need to be taken into account. For example, imagine developing an AI system that will be allowed to make certain actions in external environment, in kind of real three-dimensional physical world, and that can be very risky. So we need to think about appropriate safeguards and what would those be. Even if AI agents are not allowed to make interactions within the physical environment, we must need to consider what is the impact that AI agents or AI scientists would have on human scientists, on their trust and on their reliance of those agents to then when performing their everyday scientific activities. But considering all these points, I believe there are many exciting opportunities for tight integration of AI and scientific research across different scientific disciplines. And we are really seeing that there is this great enthusiasm across many disciplines about how, in a novel, interesting ways, AI can be integrated across levels from experimental biology to abstract mathematics. And with that, I'll stop my presentation here. I'm very happy to take questions later in the panel discussion.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce our third speaker, Alexander Dermore. Did I get that right? Excellent. Is a staff research scientist at Google DeepMind based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Alex's work focuses on improving the reliability, fairness, and robustness of AI systems, often using the formalism of causality, which we will definitely get to during the panel. Prior to Google, Alex received his PhD in stats at Harvard and was a visiting assistant professor at UC Berkeley in the Department of Statistics. So Alex's question is, what are the limitations of the scaling approach to AI? And for those of you who don't know, I'm sure Alex will tell you, the scaling approach to AI is what's embodied by large language models.
All right, get ready for much lower production value. I'm going to throw Andy under the bus for a second because he approached me last week and said, hey, do you want to speak at our workshop? I said, sure, but the ICML deadline is the night, or really the morning, of when they're asking me to give a brand new talk. Yes. So I don't know, how many people submitted something to ICML this year? No, they're all sleeping it off. Okay, great. So yeah, let's talk about scale and AI. This is going to be extremely breezy. Just think about it as sort of priming the pump for the panel discussion more than I think any brand new insights here. Great. So Andy gave me this prompt. What are the limitations of the LLM/scale approach to AI right now? So I dutifully typed it into Bard, and this is what came out. And actually, it's not bad. Right? So, there's this big point on limited understanding. There's some stuff on technical challenges and ethical concerns. I think this limited understanding point is actually, pretty decent. So that's my talk. Any of your questions, you can type them into Bard. I'm just kidding. I know you're all using GPT-4. So anyway. I also wanted to have some slide that was just saying, LLMs are eating the world. Basically, as we sort of scale up the computation that's being put into large language models, they're becoming ever more useful for all kinds of very surprising application areas, right? I think this was sort of my, this past year was really my first time going to family conversations where everybody wanted to talk to me about the work that I'm doing, right? And everybody has had some very surprising use case for this, right? Whether it's drafting emails or, my friends who are professors, writing recommendation letters, right? There are all kinds of different everyday use cases. And, I think people are getting very imaginative about the different ways that large language models can sort of fit into their lives. And so I really wanted an image that was something like LLMs are eating the world, but Bard wouldn't give it to me. It's a work in progress. All right, so maybe also as a piece of context for this overall thought, I think there was this very not 1999. This should be 2019. It feels much longer ago. Anyway, there was a really nice piece that Rich Sutton, who's one of the sort of big players in reinforcement learning, wrote in one of his blog posts several years ago, long before large language models, right? I guess if you've been following when the BERT era was sort of taking off, which was maybe the last generation of language models, right? He wrote that the biggest lesson that can be read from 70 years of AI research is that general methods that leverage computation are ultimately the most effective, and by a large margin. Right? And in particular, he was arguing against researchers seeking to leverage their human knowledge of a domain, right? Because he was saying, look, you can make incremental gains in the short term, but ultimately, once we get to the next framework, right, where we can leverage ever more computation, that's going to be the thing that ends up moving the benchmarks forward. And this was titled The Bitter Lesson because this is exactly what AI researchers don't want to hear, right? We want to use our big brains and our nice insights in order to make our machine learning systems or our AI systems better, right? But at least if we look at where the huge step changes in progress have happened in machine learning and AI over the last 20 years, a lot of it has basically been, let's find something that we can throw ever more computation at and ever more data at, and then see what happens. And of course, there have been amazing insights that go into those, right, that have gone into those different advances. But a lot of the benefits that we're reaping are ones that come from ultimately having ideas that can scale up. So I think that there's some nuance that is that's useful to bring to this, right? One of them is that, right, scale can yield both smooth changes and step changes in terms of the quality of systems that we're building, right? And so smooth changes, I will say, right, can come from scaling up within a certain paradigm, whereas step changes can come from enabling qualitatively new ways to interact with models and to leverage compute and data. And really, both of these can outpace different sort of human heuristics where we try to maybe like enforce one inductive bias at a time or something like that. Right. And so I would say that right now, at least from where I'm sitting, what I've been seeing is that large language models and models that more generally incorporate some amount of language they've introduced this step change in the way that machine learning and AI systems are trained, are used. And so I'll try to talk a little bit about what this change was and whether we can, or really whether because this is like extremely subjective, right? Whether I expect more step changes to come from scaling alone. And so I think I'll also maybe qualify what I'm saying here to say that I'm thinking about this as just, what if we think about the large language model itself as sort of an isolated model, right? Just something that's modeling ever more language that we have, rather than, I think, a potentially broader set of innovations that have to do with building these ecosystems of agents, like Marika was just talking about. And I think that there's a more interesting conversation to have about this sort of potentially more complex ecosystem approach. All right, let's see. All right, so I'll give you my mental model, and again, it is not particularly sophisticated, and so you can think about this as a straw man if you want to argue against it. I think there are plenty of ways to argue against this, but I would say that large language models are aspirationally universal translators that have a fuzzy you-know-what-I-mean interface, right? And I think this you-know-what-I-mean interface is the thing that has really sort of captured people's imagination over the last year or so, right? So when I talk about like a you-know-what-I-mean query, what it means is it's a kind of query that a system can only answer if it's able to combine that query with some amount of world knowledge, right? Right. For example, queries that name a particular task and provide some arguments. So something like, write me a recommendation letter for somebody with these characteristics, right? I haven't specified to the model in that prompt what a recommendation letter is, right? I am sort of relying on the model's internal understanding of what a recommendation letter is and how these different characteristics fit into something that I call that has this template of a recommendation letter, right? There might be queries with undefined entities, right? So for example, I might ask a large language model what the meaning of the poem "The Road Not Taken" is, or as I did this morning, a misidentified entity where I said, what is the meaning of the poem "The Road Less Traveled?" And Bard corrected me and said, you mean the road not taken, and these are some interpretations of it. Right? And then also creative queries, right? So something like, tell me a story in the style of this particular author, or rewrite this recommendation letter in the style of a ballad by Bruce Springsteen or something, right? Like these are things that people actually got acceptable outputs when they were playing around with ChatGPT a year ago, and this really helped a lot of people's imaginations take off with what large language models can do. So I think that's one of the central innovations, one of the central step changes that came from large language models. But at the same time, I'm trying to use this word translator specifically to sort of limit the scope of the kind of reasoning that I think large language models are doing now. And also, I think the scope of how much reasoning we can expect from large language models if we just scale up the way that we are already training them right now, right? And so, right, when I talk about a translator, right, that essentially means that most reasoning operations are more sort of syntactic transformations, right? Like taking something with this meaning and then just rewriting that meaning in a different way, right? Or maybe augmenting that meaning with some fuzzy lookups, but not something that is deeply semantic. Now, I'm not defining any of these terms because I'm not sure that they actually have crisp definitions to begin with, but hopefully you know what I mean. Okay. Yeah, so I think, just to sort of harp on this point a little bit more about how enabling models with language has really shifted a paradigm, right? I think it's useful to think about these different paradigms of machine learning that we've gone through, maybe like the last 10 years, right? And of course, like every one of these is still an active paradigm that people are using, right? But in terms of what's taking up a lot of the sort of conversation space right now, I'd say that, right, starting from maybe the time that image models started getting really good around the ImageNet challenge in like 2012, right? People started being very interested in end-to-end machine learning, right? Where you define a task, you collect a bunch of data that has these input-output pairs, and then you train and evaluate a model using just that data and on the particular task that you had in mind, and then you'll serve that model, right? And then that'll be the thing that you expect somebody to use downstream. Then later on, we started talking about maybe we don't want to train a single model from scratch for every task, right? Maybe what we can do is actually leverage some more general knowledge that we can get from larger data sets and start pre-training models using some self-supervised tasks. So this is this is very similar to what Marinka was talking about with having say masked language models, right? Where you define this task where you're going to hide some of the words in a sequence and then ask a model to predict what the missing words are. Or also a self-supervised task is what most large language models are trained on now, which is just to predict what the next word is, right? And so you can define one of these self-supervised tasks that isn't that interesting on its own, but what having a self-supervised task allows you to do is to collect even more weakly or unlabeled data, right? And so instead of having to have this sort of very structured input-output system, you can now just sort of collect data that you find much more conveniently, and then you'll train your or pre-train your model, right, using this self-supervised task. And then after you've pre-trained the model, then you might think about that as its own artifact. You can even pass that on to somebody else, and then somebody else can define their own task that they want. And for their task, they'll collect some input and label data, right, and then fine-tune your pre-trained model for their specific task, right, and then they'll serve, right. But the thing that this did, right, was that it sort of delayed the point at which you actually define your task, right, to be after when most of the computation and training was done, right? And now what it seems like is happening with large language models and this sort of what I mean paradigm is that, right, we are doing this pre-training and we're training, and then maybe we're doing a little bit of fine-tuning to sort of get the task formatting. This is called like instruction tuning, right, where you, instead of getting a model to be like an autocomplete model, you get it to be a model that expects you to ask a question so it can answer it, right, or sort of fine-tune it to be more like dialogue, right? So we'll do a little bit of fine-tuning there. Maybe we'll collect some preference data to do a little bit of fine-tuning, and then we'll just serve that model, right, without actually defining the task. And we'll let people who are interacting with the model define the task on the fly, right? So this is like I open up Bard or GPT-4, and it doesn't know what I'm going to ask it to do, right? I'm going to type in a description of my task and then expect it to provide some solution to that task, right? So now we're defining the task sort of on the fly at the very end, right? And then it's sort of up to you to evaluate how well the model did at the end. So I think this has been a major paradigm shift, and maybe this ability to define a task at the very end is the kind of thing that people think of as sort of general intelligence. I try to stay away from those terms in my everyday work, but I think the point of this workshop is to maybe try to approach it. Great. So what I will say, so I think the you know what I mean framework does some really nice things in terms of creating positive feedback loops for improving models, right? So one thing is that it allows you to use a lot more data, right? Because you're no longer required to collect data that comes in a very restricted format, right? We can have these sort of fuzzy inputs and then expect the model to figure out how those fuzzy inputs line up with some end task that we have in mind. And so one example of this is not actually from large language models, but from vision language models, right? Where there's like this the set of models called CLIP that people might be familiar with, where instead of having to train a model that has like an image and then a label that a human labeler had to assign to it, you could just take the caption that somebody had written for that image, right? And then instead of training a model to just predict a specific label, what you could do is give a model a batch of images and then just ask the model to match each image to the appropriate caption, right? And so being able to work in this paradigm where we can sort of take natural language as this weak, unstructured label has been really nice for enabling the use of all captioned images on the internet, right? Not just some fixed subset of images that humans have explicitly labeled for machine learning tasks, right? To train ever larger and ever more capable vision understanding models. Right. Similarly, right, you can build synthetic data using large language models. For example, if you want to if you want to do like semantic parsing of sentences, you can do a pretty good job of having a large language model do that semantic parsing for you, and then you can use that to further understand some of the ways that large language models are structuring their outputs. Right, and then there are also like there's some evidence that using language is actually doing some very nice things for the inductive biases of representations that models are building, and this sort of moves up bleeds into my next point about querying different modalities and. Right, being able to understand, for example, images in terms of descriptions of objects that sort of appear there. Right, so this is sort of enabling wider usage of machine learning models that take things like images as inputs. And then the final thing is that, right, in this you know what I mean paradigm, the inputs and the outputs from the model are all in the same format. Right, they're all in natural language. And what that means is that you can get these models to consume their own input, or you can have these models interact with each other and chain together different kinds of commands together. And so this does create this opportunity for building ecosystems, like Marinka was talking about. And I think that's one of the extremely sort of exciting prospects going forward. And I think that this can enable a lot of enlarged capabilities, although like in my in the sort of universal translator, I guess, scoping that I was trying to provide for large language models, I would consider that a lot of these sort of ecosystem things would be their own system, right, rather than thinking about them as being self-contained in the LLM. Okay, so now we can ask a question like, how are large language models doing on higher order reasoning right now, right? Like, do we think that scaling up large language models is going to lead to, better reasoning from the large language models themselves beyond doing sort of fuzzy lookups or syntactic transformations? And, we do see that there is some sort of compositional generalization in the sense that you can define an operation that you'd like the large language model to do and switch out the different operands or arguments that you're passing into that operation. And a lot of the time, you will get a successful result. Not all of the time, and getting that to be reliable is, I think, very difficult, right? And even when large language models are succeeding at some of these tasks, right? It's very clear that they are succeeding at them not by implementing known algorithms, right? So if there is a well-known algorithm for doing something like addition, it is very clear that the large language models that we've trained so far are not using the standard algorithm for doing addition, even though it would be a very efficient way to implement it. Okay, and so what I'll say here is that there may be some aspects of higher order reasoning or compositional generalization that are happening, but ultimately, when we ask the models to extrapolate in this way, the way that they extrapolate is very unpredictable right now. Right? And a lot of the time, that extrapolation is happening by the model sort of the model using this "you know what I mean" capability, right, to guess at what you want that extrapolation to be, right? And so sometimes that is successful, and other times it's not, right? Because the training data sort of doesn't specify exactly which extrapolation is the most appropriate one. Okay, let's see. And so, you know, I've put forward this sort of argument that I think, like, as long as we are asking large language models to extrapolate, we're not necessarily going to get the kind of reasoning that we actually want all of the time. Because it's sort of ambiguous to the model what kind of reasoning or extrapolation should happen. But, you know, if I guess a key question here is, like, can we actually evaluate this claim that I'm making that the generalization is going to be limited? You know, it's really hard to do, right? I think that one aspect of, again, the "you know what I mean" paradigm is that it's sort of adversarial to actually probing whether the model understands something, right? So sometimes I'll say that we're essentially teaching to the Turing test, right? Like, we are teaching these models to sound we're teaching these models to use language the way that humans use language, right? And we're teaching these models to speak about topics like humans that understand those topics in the way that humans understand them. And so it is very difficult to probe these models to see whether they actually understand something in the same way that a human understands them, or whether, you know, we actually even know what that question means. Right, and so I think this sort of interacts with a lot of Sam's points, and I think he could teach me a lot about this. Right, and then like a second issue here is that when we talk about whether or not large language models are generating in some strong way, it's really difficult to even say what generalization is when we don't really know what's in the data, right? And as we continue to scale up more and more, the data sets that we're using become more and more opaque, right? So consider that even indexing the data sets that we're using to train some of these large language models is almost as hard as indexing the entire web, right? And so, you know, some of the strategies that have been used here are basically to create a mismatch between, like, what information a "you know what I mean" system would impute to try to make your query sort of well-defined, and the query that you actually have in mind, like creating a gap there to see whether we can sort of understand what inductive biases the model has. And I think that there's basically just a lot of work to be done here to try to figure that out. And the final thing is that there's this sort of, like, combinatorial context, task, behavior set of scenarios that we would need to evaluate to say whether or not a large language model actually understands this concept in this context when it's performing this task, right? And, like, this is where the flexibility of large language models becomes this double-edged sword, right? On one hand, we can specify to the large language model that we want its behavior to be extremely context-specific when we give it a particular task. But what that means is that it's very difficult to generalize the results of some evaluation that was done in one of these tuples to another one of those tuples, right? So to give, like, a very concrete example of that, that's extremely simple, but was something that I was working on last night. So we were doing this very simple study looking at whether large language models encode correlations between occupation and gender, right? This is the kind of statistical correlation thing that we often worry about when we're talking about large language models. And one of the benchmark tasks to look at this is part of the so-called gender sensitivity task in the big bench set of benchmarks. It is so simple, right? Essentially what you do is you take a word for an occupation, you say occupation is, then you have a blank here, and then you have a bunch of masculine words and a bunch of feminine words that you can substitute in here. You look at the probability that the model assigns to those different words, and then you look at whether there's some kind of imbalance in those probabilities, right? And so the different things that you can look at are neutrality, so whether the model appears to put equal weight onto those things, just overall prevalence, which is like whether the model just tends to put much more probability on male words or female words in general, and then some correlation or stereotype, right, which looks at whether the model appears to provide probabilities that are correlated with the actual gender occupancy in different occupations, according to like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? So what you'll see here on those three metrics for some llama models in blue, some palm models in orange, across different scales. So from left to right within the blues, we're looking at 7 billion, 13 billion, 70 billion parameters. And then on the right here, we're looking at palm extra small, small, medium, large. Right, you see that like depending on which of these statistics you're using, you would say, okay, some of these some of these models are more neutral than others. Some of these models are more skewed than others, or lean into stereotypes in one direction or the other more than another one. But what you might really be interested in, right? No one's interested in this task, right? No one really cares whether a large language model, like what it's going to say to occupation is blank, right? Usually what someone's using a large language model to do is some kind of generation task, like, hey, I want to write my kid a bedtime story. Write me a story about a child who grows up to be a blank, right? Or I'm a product manager. I would like you to write me a user persona about somebody in this occupation who's using, say, an LLM-generated product, right? Right. And so if you then compute these same metrics on stories, like this is the user persona task, right? You'll see that these, like if you look at the ordering of these models, right, on these different metrics, they're completely different. If you wanted to choose the best one based on this metric, you might end up choosing one of the worst ones, right? And in fact, depending on the different task that you try to use the model for, you will end up with very different implied notions of the correlation between gender and occupation, right? And so this is like one of these sort of context specificity issues where, even if we're going to be talking about something like, does a large language model understand X? I think it will also be important to say, well, does that evidence continue to carry over to different tasks where we might expect that knowledge to actually be used? I suspect that we're going to see that there are a lot of different ways that these generalizations happen differently in large language models and in humans. Okay, and then solving harder problems. I think Marinka covered this really, really well, right? That essentially, like, it seems like if we want to do more deep reasoning with large language models, it requires some external structure. Right, and one thing that I think is very key here is some notion of output level validation, right? That is, when an output comes out of a model, I need to be able to tell whether that's actually a good output, right? This is sort of the danger that we see right now, where people are trying to use large language models to augment their own knowledge, right? To say like, oh, maybe I'll just have the large language model teach me statistics, or something like that. I guarantee, well, I don't know if I can guarantee this, but my strong prior is that no one is going to learn p-values very well from a large language model, mostly because humans are really bad at explaining p-values. And so I think the large language model will be too, right? And so I think this is often like a blocker to bootstrapping, right? Like having the large language model sort of correct its own knowledge or teach itself something, right? Because ultimately there is so much, large language models at this point, and I don't see this necessarily going away, are so unreliable in the responses that they give that it's very possible, right, that it can teach itself something bad. I'll say another key challenge here is trying to characterize this overall distribution of language that the large language model has encoded, given a particular prompt. I think this is just a super interesting question, right? Instead of thinking about just individual samples coming from a large language model, thinking about how to characterize the variety of of responses that a large language model can give. And in fact, I think this is a place where some of the creativity questions that we talked about might actually be useful to probe them, right? To, instead of thinking about a large language model as a repository of knowledge, think about it as something that can generate a bunch of human-like responses to a particular query, most of which will be garbage, but some of which might actually be very interesting, right? And I think this is actually what has sort of, where we've seen some of the cool progress coming in, like some of the mathematical applications of large language models, right? Just like, give me a bunch of hypotheses that are at least coherent on a language level, and then we'll take care of validating which ones actually work or not. Okay, great. So this is the big summary, right? My take is that large language models are sort of translators plus this fuzzy you know what I mean interface. They're not quite reasoning the way that we want them to. And I'm not sure that just scaling up is going to solve that reasoning problem. At the same time, you know what I mean can really take us very far, right? But at the same time, it's this double-edged sword, right, where we are asking the model to fill in the blanks for what we want, and there are no guarantees about how it's going to fill in those blanks, right? My take is hard to falsify, but I think there are some positive feedback loops there. Anyway, I think we can get more benefit talking to the panelists than just me continuing to talk. So thank you very much.
So this is going to be an interactive panel. I think I'll start things off with a few questions, and once we get the ball rolling, I'm going to walk around and hand you this mic on the screen. You can use that to ask your questions, and the panelists will respond. So where do I want to start? So maybe I think I want to start with Alex, because we had talked about this a little bit. So your framing of LLMs as universal translators. This is an old framing. This is indeed the sort of motivation for the Turing test. That if you can talk to something behind a prompt and it can respond to you, or behind a screen, respond to you with the right things back, that is sufficient for general intelligence. Famously, John Searle countered with this Chinese room argument. I think you know this. But his argument was, if you have a room and you can pass symbols in Chinese and you get the correct Chinese symbols back out, and there's just someone on the inside who has a very large lookup table. So when they see these certain symbols come in, they know they need to pass these other symbols back. This doesn't mean that the room understands Chinese. So it seemed to me that this is a very similar framing that you were offering, but it wasn't clear to me if you said that this was sufficient for general intelligence, or this is just what you think the LLMs are doing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and maybe that was on purpose. Yeah, I guess I think I personally feel horribly underqualified to actually discuss what the word intelligence means. But at the same time, I think the Searle argument was also maybe like whether the person sitting in the room actually understands Chinese. And
I think it's whether does the room
the room as a thing. Okay, yeah, because I would say maybe the lookup table is the thing that arguably understands Chinese.
Well, there's lots of response, and we're getting to the responses to the Chinese room argument.
Yeah. So I went back and read the Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry on this after we talked about it, and I saw that there was this big discussion about intentionality and that sort of thing, and I think that actually sort of relates to this idea of right. I think one idea that is often associated with intelligence is this notion of like some kind of singular agency, and I think that in the context of large language models, that's maybe not a great model for. Or not a great mental model for what the large language model is doing. Specifically because I think there are many different ways that you can prompt a large language model to essentially get a completely different agent out. If you would think about like some kind of like mode in the distribution of, in the conditional distributions of language as being, an agent that's like somewhat coherent or something like that. I would actually love to have a more formal definition of agent, and I would love to write a paper equating large language models to clown cars, because I think that's essentially the way that I tend to think about it. So already there's this question about whether you can even say something like a large language model understands X, right? Because it might at the very least require some qualification, like a large language model prepared in a particular way understands X. And even then, I'm not exactly sure what the word understands means.
Maybe this would be a good place to tap Salmon. Sam, could you clarify what it means to understand something?
How do we know when people understand?
Exactly.
I mean, we don't get to look inside their brains most of the time, and even when we do, what is that going to tell us, right? Our understanding of human intelligence, just in the everyday sense, not in the scientific sense, is defined at some level, not necessarily in terms of behavior, but certainly conditionally on behavior, right? Like we interact with people, and we come based on the data we collect about them. We say whether they're smart or not, or what they know or don't know, and so on, right? So I feel like part of these debates sometimes hinges on an implicit assumption that we somehow have this deep insight into human, what it means for a human to understand things. Like I think that even introspection about yourself, it's not clear. I guess I would say that this notion of kind of conditional understanding, right? You understand something if you can basically give the correct answer when prompted in a particular way, right? I think that's also how we understand our own understanding, right? Do I understand what I'm talking about right now? It depends on how you ask me, right? And how I ask myself.
I also wonder, getting to the question of agency, is I think we all tend to think that we have two hands on the wheel at all time and we are making our own decisions. But I am also subject to contextual prompts that I'm not able to be fully aware of. So the way that I act in one context will be different in a different context. And I think it's because I'm trying to achieve my goals, but really I'm just responding to essentially external prompts. So are humans really that different from the clown car example that like Alex talked about? We contain multitudes.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. There's so much I could say about this. I would reference maybe one thing from the psychological literature. There's this great paper that was written in the 1970s by these social psychologists called "Telling More Than We Can Know," and they were interested in the idea that in the cases where we think we know why we do things, and we will readily offer an explanation for why we do things, but it cannot be the reason why we did those things, because the experimenters have subtly set up a situation in which they are actually controlling why people did what they did, which doesn't enter into their explanation. So, for example, they would set up a table with a bunch of items, like hats and gloves and stuff like that. And they knew that people would have a small tendency to choose things on the right side of the table. Okay. Now, and then so they put the same items on either the right side of the table or the left side of the table. Right. So the same item gets preferred more or less depending on which side of the table it's on. Now, when you ask people, why did you choose those gloves? They're not going to say because it was on the right side of the table. They say, oh, because I like the material or whatever. Right. And they did lots of different things like this. And there's a whole literature about this where we're basically retroactively explaining our actions that were generated by some other mysterious process. I guess the point here is that we do contain multitudes. We don't have direct access to why we do things that we do. Right?
So if you're keeping score so far, yeah. Chinese room argument, a Walt Whitman quote, and free will. So before this thing goes completely off the rails, I will turn to see if anyone from the audience would like to ask a question. So please say your name, where you're from, and then your question.
Hello, I'm Moritz. I'm from Germany, and I have a question regarding the problem. And I wondered if you could maybe offer some suggestions on how to quantify what an interesting problem is. So in the intelligence domain, we also don't really have a proper definition, but we use, for example, like test models on the MIT math exam or other exams to at least get a proxy.
Yeah, I don't think I can offer a universal definition of what makes a problem interesting. Maybe just, so this is not a complete cop-out, I'll just mention one possibility without claiming it to be a general, sort of a universal definition. So in the AI literature, there has been this interest, particularly for reinforcement learning agents, in this concept of empowerment. So the idea of empowerment is that one thing that you might want to be able to do is to do lots of stuff in your environment, right? So imagine a kind of unsupervised setting where I'm not rewarding you for doing particular things, but you can interact with your environment and discover that you're able to do more stuff, right? By basically you can improve your interactive policy in such a way that you can do more stuff in the environment without knowing whether the stuff you're doing is good or bad or neutral, right? So that's the intuition underlying empowerment. There's a formal information theoretic definition of that. And that turns out to have been useful for basically unsupervised pre-training of reinforcement learning agents, or used as a kind of auxiliary loss. My lab actually got interested in this. We basically asked the question of whether this is a useful way of thinking about how humans guide their actions in domains where there's basically not a lot of supervision. There's this game that maybe some of you have seen on the internet. You guys can go play it, not now, called Little Alchemy. And it's a very simple game. You basically you have some elements and you can combine them and make new things. And it's strangely addictive, right? Because there's no points or anything, and there's no goal. But people play this game for like hours and hours and hours sometimes. And so we actually obtained a data set of many thousands of people playing this game. And we were interested in sort of what keeps them going, what are they trying to do in this game, and we did a whole bunch of analyses to support this idea that they're seeking empowerment of some sort. Yeah.
So going back to your constraint theory of intelligence, so would a succinct summary of that definition be something is more intelligent if it has more degrees of freedom in a specific environment?
I mean, I guess I'm suspicious of such simple definitions, but yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, right? I think we'd often be happy in saying that an agent is more intelligent if it can sort of do more stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Marinka, I had a question for you. So I think a big open question in the field is how much can be learned from essentially like a brain in a vat, which is one way to think about what an LLM is. It's something that's passively consuming data. It can, to the extent that we believe this is possible for an LLM, introspect, do sort of counterfactual kinds of things. How important specifically for AI models that we hope to advance science do you think the need for them to perform interventions or experiments? So what are the limits of observational data for AI in science? And as like one provocative counterexample, Einstein never did a single experiment himself and only did thought experiments.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's why I think that these kind of form of research teams or collaborations or ecosystems are really important. So I'll often think of large language models through in the way they currently exist in the current generation in their use in scientific discovery process as effectively engines that can help us perhaps augment search engines and help brainstorm ideas in a potentially somewhat semi-accurate, semi-factual manner, where we want to base the questions, base the outputs on existing published literature. But on the same way, we would like to allow the models to also hallucinate a bit. Or sometimes hallucination is not necessarily a bad effect, where we are brainstorming research ideas. Of course, it becomes really challenging to distinguish when those hallucinations are real patterns versus when they are, and they could kind of logically follow from the existing evidence in the literature versus when they become effectively just a story or narrative or imagination of scientists or imagination of large language model. So regarding current generation of models and the limitations of the observational data, I think one of the big promises or goals of large language models in molecular biology is this notion of creating virtual cell simulators, where ultimately what we would like to do is to have the AI models that would be able to anticipate the effect of how a cell or some other molecular system would respond after a certain intervention. And that intervention can be chemical intervention. Imagine like one is designing a new drug and they introduce a new chemical compound into a molecular system. And ideally, you would have models that would be able to anticipate and predict how the system will respond to that chemical agent before going about and doing the experiment that might be very costly and resource intensive. So, however, the challenge is that the current observational data really does not allow us to realize this principle. So I think that there is a big important gap in generating appropriate data that would consist of large-scale biological perturbations, either chemical or genetic, and measurements of response of biological systems to those perturbations. But if you would have these kind of large-scale data sets, which are now increasingly being generated in the scientific domains, and kind of large initiatives and consortia are being formed that are trying to generate those data sets at scale, then coupling those perturbational data sets together with large observational data that could come in the form of large language models being trained on medical literature or experimental data from biorepositories could really help us anticipate the value and the output of certain measurement before that measurement is actually being really instantiated or practically experimented. I think that AlphaFold was a very big breakthrough from many reasons. One of the important reasons for the field is that in many use cases of AlphaFold, we'll think of AlphaFold predictions as actual data points that are then used to train other kinds of models. And this is just like fundamentally has changed the way we think of machine learning outputs. Traditionally, machine learning outputs were predictions that are not to be trusted. You should not base your follow-up experiments or hypotheses based on those machine learning outputs until after you validate experimentally, test those hypotheses in the lab. But now what we are increasingly seeing that AlphaFold predictions made by AlphaFold and related models have achieved accuracy that is near atom level accuracy. And so what that means is that we're effectively taking those predictions and pretending or using them as they are actual results of actual experiments, and then build other models and other systems on top of those predictions. And to me, that's just a qualitative improvement in ability of ML models, because we are getting to the stage where in certain domains or certain applications, the outputs of ML models are being used as drop-in replacement instead of outputs that would be generated by many years of careful, resource-intensive work in a research lab. And so what I hope is that coupling observational data with large-scale perturbations will move us closer to being able to have performing these in silico virtual simulators that could simulate and design systems and that would allow us for multi-stage optimization and multi-stage reasoning across complex systems in biology.
Yeah, and your point about AlphaFold is great. So there's this database called the protein database, or the PDB, that has 200,000 protein structures. Each one of those protein structures represented an entire PhD dissertation worth of effort. So like 6 man years went into creating each one of those structures in the database. Now that AlphaFold has created all of these, there are now hundreds of millions of high quality predicted structures that scientists can use. And I'm going to get the number wrong, but that's like hundreds of thousands of man years or something like that that it would have taken to do that by hand. So I think that is a fantastic example. Any questions from the audience that you'd like to?
Oh, I have a question. My name is Li Tong. I'm from China, from Harvard Medical School. I have a question is, when we're using AI method into the medical field, because medical field is quite a little special compared to other fields, because no matter how good the AI method that we use, how good the result that we obtain, we need to test them by experiments, especially sometimes the clinical trials. If the AI method that we cost is much lower than the experiments, the money that we spend, that would be perfect. But if the money that we train the model is much higher than the clinical trial, shall we still insist that we need to use AI method in this condition?
Very good. You want to take that?
Great questions, and I'm sure Andy has lots of thoughts on this as well. So I think it's very important to consider the balance between, on one end, the value of insight that an AI model can provide, and the cost of downstream experiments, both in terms of the actual cost or the budget that one has as a research team, as well as the impact that AI outputs could have on real patient populations. And so that is just incredibly important for applications that go and touch clinical medicine domain, where and other high-stakes decision-making domains, where the outputs of AI models can have impact on real lives beyond just measuring the number of hours that someone spends in the lab generating or validating certain AI experiments. Regarding the clinical trials, I really like this kind of idea of, well, model understanding and what the model do versus do we need to run clinical trials for them in order to evaluate them, or do we just need to do a thorough understanding of models, or somehow really make these black box deep learning models more transparent and kind of through understanding, and only after we understand exactly what they do and what features rely on, advance them towards real world implementation at scale. And I would argue that there are many drugs that are approved on the market that are being prescribed to millions of people around the world for which we really do not understand how they work in kind of through mechanistic lens, in the sense of what their mechanism of action is, how they bind to certain biological targets, which are generally proteins, how those proteins interact with each other in these complex interaction networks. However, we still trust those drugs, and they're being prescribed, and we all take them as patients. And so clinical trials, effectively, this idea of randomization has allowed us to relatively safely, in many ways, be able to design and then deploy these kind of chemical structures in a relatively safe, controlled manner. So what I would think of for many AI models is one approach to take is to consider them and study them in similar ways as kind of drugs are being studied. And there is lots of analogies that one can draw between developing of new drugs versus and making the case, establishing that they're safe and effective, and also developing new AI models and evaluating them from the safety perspective and their utility perspective. There are also differences. The drugs are chemical structure. They don't change over time, but models generally change over time because we have new data, new algorithms, so we want to improve them. That make these clinical trial analogy slightly challenging, but I generally think that it's an interesting, productive way of how to think about thorough evaluation of models, and not necessarily worrying too much in the context of requiring all components of the model to be fully transparent and be able to fully trace back to individual level features about what certain models do. There might be different applications where that is important, perhaps for scientific understanding of new mechanisms, but for some applications in other areas of medicine, it's really important that the model works. And kind of we need to quantify what works means from the utility, safety, efficacy perspective, and it's not absolutely necessary for its everyday use for us to fully understand all of its internal mechanics.
Yeah, I'll just make one more comment, is that a clinical trial is the end of a very long and complicated pipeline in drug development. So before you get to a clinical trial, there are 5 to 7 years of target identification, lead optimization, and billions of dollars are spent on that. So like, compared to us hacking out something out in PyTorch over the weekend, like those are very different scales of economy to bring a drug to market versus an AI thing. I agree with Marinka that it should be held to the exact same standard of evidence, but if an AI trial fails, I'm not going to be as sad as the CEO of a drug company whose stock is probably going to go down 20% as a result. So there are definitely analogies there, but they also have some very meaningful differences. Any questions? Okay.
Thank you for a wonderful talk today about proteomics data on how to use that. I had a question related to predicting drug response using AI, using genomics data. So we have, from the patients who will respond. We do have collection of molecular profiling data, and we also have data from clinical trials and real-world evidence data to suggest. So is there a possibility that using this genomics data or per patient, we can predict the response better in what we're already doing? Because we already do this with biomarker analysis and all sort of things. So what are your thoughts on using these models? And also you talked about perturbation models, including that in, like how the drug will respond better based on only molecular profile or genomics data.
Yeah, so very briefly, there is quite a rich literature on now leveraging these new advances in ML in order to design models for predicting drug response. And that's exciting because for example, it can help identify new kinds of predictive biomarkers, such as multi-omic biomarkers, and multimodal learning in particular can find relevant features across different data modalities that can stratify patients into groups based on their response to drug therapies. So that, I think, it's a very interesting potential application of multimodal learning towards drug response prediction. Another one is that recent advances in few-shot learning and label-efficient learning are particularly exciting for identifying biomarkers in therapeutic areas where the number of patients or the number of clinical samples is rather small, and therefore some of the more training of large deep learning models is just not feasible. An example of that is immunotherapy, so the pillar of modern oncology treatments. Many of the clinical studies on immunotherapies are small. They have hundreds of patients, and on average, 20 to 40% of patients on immunotherapies respond to treatment. So it's a very big question in the field, who will respond and whether we can predict response to immunotherapy from treatment-naive samples, so samples taken from patients before they are put on the first treatment. And so that's a crucially important question that now can be analyzed or addressed with machine learning, and particularly few-shot learning strategies that were not accessible to many of kind of machine learning analysis just a few years ago. So I think there are many opportunities for better biomarker discovery that are more robust, generalizable, and also doing that in the context of certain novel therapeutic modalities.
Thanks. So I'd like to broaden it back out and ask the same question to all three of you, because something that I heard from each one of your talks is the necessary of an inductive bias. And so at a high level, an inductive bias is a set of assumptions about the world, regularities that you impose on a model. Sam has done work in inductive biases in human cognition. I think having a 3D bias and looking at a 2D picture is a good example of that. Alex has actually looked at the lack of inductive biases or under-specification and how that causes problems for machine learning. And obviously, Marinka is one of the world's best experts in graph neural networks, which is its own set of inductive biases. So we really have three experts on inductive biases here. So I guess the question I'd like to ask is, what inductive biases are we missing? So I think physicists would say all you need are locality and invariance. So like you need to know that computation is local, and that you need to know that the laws of the universe are the same everywhere, no matter where you look. So I can imagine that transformers encode some notion of locality. So they're looking at words that are close together through some learned distance metric. Maybe they're doing some kind of invariance, or maybe I'm way off track, and what we need is an entirely different set of inductive biases for machine learning. So Sam, what type of inductive biases do you think we're missing in AI currently? That's a novel word to discover.
I'm still stuck on your physical analogy, right? Yeah. Because is there any reason to think that natural language follows physical principles?
No, so that is a set of general inductive biases that seems to have been productive in other areas of science.
Right. I'm just saying that, if you ask a physicist what you need to explain the elementary physical laws, right? They might say that, right? Yeah. But if you ask them to explain, natural language, only the ones with the most hubris would say that.
Well, the same everything in between apply, that right? is just a matter of having a fast enough computer, right? Like.
Yeah. I guess I would ask a follow-up question before trying to answer this, which is, inductive bias for what? What is it that you're trying to do, right? Because I'm very willing to concede that some things require weaker or stronger inductive biases depending on what you're trying to do.
That's fair. So I think the comparison here, to throw it back to you, is some general definition of. So we often see claims in the literature and other places of like large language models fail on X in some really embarrassing way that people would never fail, and that's because they don't have a world model, they don't have some richer internal model that they're using to understand the world, and so I think the comparison here is humans. So what inductive biases, algorithmic inductive biases, are we missing to get our machines to be more like people?
Okay, all right, there are a few important things to unpack here, right? So one is, I think we should all be suspicious of statements of the form, large language models can't do X, right? I mean, this used to be, a popular thing to say about, neural networks can't do blah, blah, blah.
Some
right?
of your fellow cognitive scientists have made an entire carear out of this.
You're right, but I just think it's just not tenable, right? Because first of all, there's no in principle, there's no theorem that says, that they can't do X for most X that we care about. And then just in practice, we just see that they can do a lot of things that people used to say they can't do. So I just, and in any case, right, when we're talking about, GPT-4, right, we should be thinking about GPT 4000, right? Mm-hmm. Like that, because that's what we care about at the end of the day. Like, I don't think we should make any strong generalizations about the technology as it exists right now. So that's one caveat there. The other caveat is,
and just to unpack that, implicit in that is the idea that we have the right ones, and scaling will resolve some of the.
Well, no, I'm not really making a claim about that. What I'm really saying is that it's dangerous to make some strong claim about what a language model can or can't do until you've seen the best possible language model that doesn't exist yet, right? But that's not to say that language models are the answer to everything. I'm just saying, like, if you're talking about language models, right? The other thing is, you use the expression algorithmic inductive bias, and that's actually kind of a subtle issue, right? Because the language models are just doing next token prediction, right? Mm-hmm. And the algorithm is just the algorithm is a transformer, right? But we don't when you give it lots of data, right? Or sorry, let me frame this a slightly different way. Okay, so and this comes back to some things that Alex was bringing up. I think that what we really care about when we talk about learning in the context of a language model is not the learning of the language model, but the learning that the language model can do in, as they say, in context. Or I forget what you had a different name for this, but it's sort of the same idea. Yeah. Right.
It's a great framing.
Like, yeah, right. So that's the most interesting thing is, like, you can open up the language model and you can give it some data in the context, right? And then you conditional on that data, you're gonna ask it some question, and that is itself a learning problem. And I think that's the most relevant comparison. If we're talking about comparisons between humans and machines, that's the most relevant comparison, right? Because when I bring a human subject into an experimental task, they have behind them their whole life history and all the evolutionary history of their species, right? And that's sort of what the language model training is standing in for. And then, and now you're going to give humans some data, you can give the language models the same data, and you can ask, what do they learn? So then the question is, what are the inductive biases for that? Not the inductive biases for training transformers, but the inductive biases that have been implicitly learned. And there, it's just really hard to say what that is. Like, the only way we can get at that is actually the same way that we understand human inductive biases, by interacting with the system. Anyway, I don't want to keep. You guys probably have other things to say, but maybe I'll stop.
Sure, yeah.
But I guess I didn't really answer your question.
No, it's a hard question to answer, to be fair.
Yeah.
And it may not have an answer. I was just curious. So I think that perspective was helpful, especially with respect to what is very helpful. Maybe Alex?
Sure. No, I want to continue on that point, because I do think that the in-context learning thing is like a super interesting question. Right, because this is one way that you can sort of figure out what a model's, or so I have in the past tended to use the word inductive bias in a little bit different way from the way that people think primarily about learning rather than evaluating machine learning models tend to think about it. Like I think about an inductive bias as not only something that helps a model learn, but also the thing that it leans on to extrapolate to, like different situations that it's never seen before. And so from that perspective, I think that we can empirically uncover a bunch of missing inductive biases by trying to see whether a large language model will give you the right answer if you say perturb a question in a particular way that should be that its answer should be invariant to. So for example, there's this line of work where people were teaching transformers how to do linear regression, where you could just put data in, like input data, then the output, right? Input vector, then the output, right? And you could sort of set it up like that. You train the model on millions of these linear regression problems, and then you can give it a completely new set of vectors and outputs, and then it will predict points according to that regression line, right? Even regression lines that it's never seen before in its training data, right? So you can train a transformer to do linear regression in context. But if you do all of that training with all of the outputs in random order, and then use that same model, and this time you sort all of your inputs and outputs according to the value of the output, right? That shouldn't matter to something that's actually implementing linear regression. But it does matter for the model, right? The model actually starts guessing that maybe there's supposed to be this increasing trend or something like that. There's some tension that sort of arises in the model where it's now like, oh wait, is this like a bunch of IID data points? Is this a time series problem, right? And so, yeah, I think it's very interesting to see which of those inductive biases sort of end up getting dredged up by a particular prompt. And there is this this just grab bag of inductive biases that you can pull out of a large language model. I think that's one of the super interesting things about training one of these models on almost the entirety of digitized human text, is that there are just so many different patterns that we can't even imagine that get dredged up. And some of those patterns you can actually just find by doing like n-gram lookups, right? There's this paper called Infinigram or something that did this very sort of awesome algorithmically efficient way of doing n-gram lookups in some of the like giant large language model training corpora. They showed that you can actually make a ton of progress in terms of perplexity just by like using this n-gram model, which incorporates no learning at all, right? And so I don't know, in terms of what inductive biases are there or missing. Yeah, I guess maybe part of the question is like, which inductive bias do you want the model to match to a particular context? And I think there are lots of cases where it seems a little bit random, right? Or you rephrase your prompt in a particular way, or make it phrase it like you were speaking British English instead of American English or something. You'll get a completely different sort of response. Right?
That's funny, and maybe Marinka agrees with this, but I always thought an inductive bias was something that we give the model. So a set of constraints or something like that we have imposed on the model that reflects some prior knowledge. But it sounds like maybe you think that, per your definition, it's something that's learned or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I would say that. So one thing that I think is interesting in large-scale machine learning, and this is sort of bringing the inductive biases back to the pre-training stage, is that at first when we started making a lot of these sort of like scale-based improvements in machine learning, people thought that it was because we had specified the right inductive bias. Like for image models, convolutions were the right inductive bias, and this is the thing that allowed us to solve ImageNet. But then, right, as we've sort of scaled up models and their flexibility and figured out the right way to sort of scale up the model size in proportion to the data size, right, there's been this great line of work that sort of goes back and says, okay, what if we just like, tear out that inductive bias that we had and then plug in this other one, use the same sort of training techniques, what will happen then? And, you can actually train those models up to about the same at least like qualitative performance level, right? Maybe like a couple of percentage points difference, but not the kind of thing where you would say that it's sort of a complete paradigm shift. And so like I think one of the reasons that people are so attracted to scale is the idea that you can choose your inductive bias less based on what it's going to do to your data and more based on how compatible it is with the hardware that you have.
Can I just add one thing to this? It seems to me that a lot of the recent progress, it comes from the insight that in some sense your data are your parameters, right? And you see this in some ways very explicitly, like for example,
Kernel methods.
Well, there's kernel methods, but I was actually thinking about data augmentation, right? Where the space of data augmentation, essentially it's treating data as a kind of parameter that you can choose the distributional structure of that, right? And that's a way of encoding inductive biases through the data, right? So anyway, that's another example of where like it's less about the architecture and the priors on parameters and so on. Okay.
Yeah, so great discussion. What can I add to that? So I would say that we often think in the context of AI for biology and medicine, we often think of inductive biases as a set of assumptions that someone that is designing, implementing the algorithm imposes on the model or the data, more recently on the data, but traditionally more on how the model is designed. So in the context of AlphaFold, what does that mean, right? So, or AlphaFold style models, imagine we have a molecule, so it's this three-dimensional object that exists in three-dimensional world. And so if we take this molecule and just translate it, right? So just we move it from here to here by a small amount, right? And assuming everything else is kept the same, then we would agree that many properties of that molecule should remain the same. So we would then like that our ML model that is predicting properties of a molecule would return the exact same output or prediction if that molecule is here, or if it's here, or perhaps if it's here, or so on, right? And so okay, how can we achieve that? The way to achieve that is to design a model that is invariant to translations, right? And there are other kinds of symmetries that we might want our models to implement, such as invariance to rotations. Perhaps we don't translate a molecule, but we rotate the molecule, and we again would expect the ML model to produce the same kind of output. So in my line of work, we often think of these kind of inductive biases as assumptions that we impose on the algorithms, and we often need to think really carefully about these kind of inductive biases. And perhaps that's the case because sometimes we operate in areas where we cannot solve everything, but just scaling up the models to be larger models that are trained on larger amounts of data. And that is true in certain areas of science where generating data is really resource-intensive, challenging problem. And so, and for some reasons, there's just no data that to be generated. Imagine studying rare diseases. By definition, they're rare diseases, so there are few patients that have rare disease. So you cannot just go around and collect more data. There are just no patients with those diseases. So what can you do to leverage the data that you have in the most efficient or effective manner? Or sometimes there are certain areas or cell types, brains or tissues that are just not accessible to experimentation or probing in living humans. So then any kind of samples that we have from those kind of systems or from those contexts or data sets are really precious, and we want to leverage them to the maximum of their ability. So because of that, in the context of biology and medicine, thinking very carefully about inductive biases that are often implemented algorithmically seems to be quite an important direction to pursue. I would say that more broadly speaking, there are inductive biases that are hard for me to articulate that would relate to this broader notion of common sense reasoning. And sometimes people talk about naive physics, but kind of this idea that Andy also mentioned, where the model makes a mistake that's such an obvious mistake that perhaps everyone would know that kind of does not make sense, but the model produces that kind of output. And it's really hard to think about what the appropriate inductive biases would be to kind of achieve common sense reasoning. Perhaps just as a final note, what was very interesting study we recently did on inductive biases is we actually had a chance to train some of our models on data that was generated on space station. So it was a very cool, interesting data set where there were two groups of genetically identical rodents, and one group of rodents was kept at Kennedy Space Station here on Earth, and the other group of genetically identical rodents, they traveled to space station and spent several weeks there, right? And so NASA is very interested in studying this question because they want to understand how being exposed to this in environments in space will affect human health and the ability of humans to spend longer periods of time in space, right? So that was their goal with this study. What was interesting for us is to then train the same model on data generated on Earth and then evaluate it on data collected in space. So it's kind of this out of this world type of transfer learning in its most concrete way. And so the models failed so miserably. I cannot tell you in how many ways the models failed because, for example, because of the changed physics properties, the RNA-seq data or transcriptomics data that are being that is kind of being collected in space is kind of has its own set of biases that are very different than any kind of biases or batch effects that we see on transcriptomics data when it's being generated by Illumina sequencers or other kinds of experiments platforms here on Earth. And so this simply, to me, this was an interesting story because it also revealed that sometimes we are encoding inductive biases in our models without really being very careful or even being aware of them, which can lead to very surprising effects where you try to transfer model to very, very different setups than setups that the models were trained on.
That's an awesome story. All right, so let's go back to the audience to see if anyone else has any questions. I can just keep asking. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Erin Walsh. I work at Harvard Medical School. I was wondering to what extent you think the idea of developing a general intelligence machine or something that approximates human intelligence is limited by our inability to model all of the sensory systems that we experience the world, all of the inputs that are coming in through all of our sensory systems, and how that affects the AI landscape and broadly speaking.
I have just one thought on that. I don't think there is a clear answer on that, at least from my perspective. But there is an interesting discussion in the field. For example, what is the meaning of the word table? And some argue that you can learn the meaning of the word table by really looking at many other words that the word table co-occurs with in large corpora, and that this distributional nature of word co-occurrence can then allow you to generate really generalizable signature or embedding of the word table. And some others argue that to really get the essence of the word table, the only way to do that is that the table should exist as an object in some real-world environment, and you need to interact with it. And then that's how we learned the meaning of the word table. And there is quite a bit of research ongoing and questions in this area of embodied AI. And I don't have a kind of a good answer of how to go about that. And how would we even collect this kind of sensor data at a scale and how to do that in an ethical way. And then assuming we would collect that data, leveraging it might be quite challenging. But how that relates to general intelligence, I will leave it. Give it to Sam to try to answer.
Please.
You guys giving all the hard questions.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to give, obviously, a definitive answer to this, but I will maybe make a few observations. So one is that, so if we're talking about like the most peripheral sensors of like in your retina, there is one thing you might be interested in is the fact that there's a 100-fold reduction in the number of cells going from the outputs of the retina, the retinal ganglion cells, into the optic nerve fibers that take information into the brain. Okay, so however many cells you have in your retina, there's a 100-fold reduction in the amount of, in some sense, in the amount of information that's being passed on to the brain. That suggests maybe that there's a lot of sensory information that's actually being discarded by your brain. That's one point of view. Another observation is that there are people with dramatic impairments in their sensory abilities, right? So congenitally blind people, for example. And one of the remarkable things about people with some of these impairments is that they're remarkably normal in a lot of ways. And in particular, they're remarkably normal in surprising ways that we would think of as being sort of connected to intelligence. So studies of blind children reveal that they have an incredibly rich visual vocabulary, right? and it comes back to what is a table, right? I mean, of course they have tactile interactions and so on, right? But they don't see tables, but they can describe what a table looks like. And if you read these descriptions, you might be hard pressed to distinguish between the blind child's description and the non-blind child's description, right? So those are all pieces of data that suggest that maybe I think modeling the sensory array is important, but maybe it's not the kind of the critical key to unlocking everything.
I guess just to piggyback on that, like how important do you think embodiment is for general forms of intelligence? So again, I use the analogy of a brain in the vat, and that's kind of what we have now. But do you think there needs to be some type of physical grounding for AI?
I think it, again, depends a lot on what you want to do, right? I just don't see, I mean, there's certain things, like obviously if you want to understand how to do motor control, you need to be grounded with some motor plant, right? There's no way to say anything about that.
I guess,
right?
so like how important is it for physical intuition to be able to roll around and poke things versus watching YouTube videos?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. I think that, well, I mean, one thing we can say about this is that infants, when they're born, they do have some physical knowledge. I mean, I don't think we want to say that it's fully fledged common sense reasoning, but I mean, actually, one of the most amazing things that was discovered recently is that, some of you may know this, that, so before a baby is born, there are actually what are called retinal waves, so waves of patterned activity over their retina. This is before they've even opened their eyes. Okay, so they're not getting any visual information from the external world, but their brain is producing some kind of pattern visual stimulation, and at some point, it was figured out. Oh yeah, sorry, and I should say that if you mess that up, then there are impairments both in the development of the receptive fields of visual areas and also in visual behavior. But the interesting thing is that those patterns of waves resemble what you'd expect from optic flow of an animal moving through an environment in depth. Okay, so it's as though our brain has come pre-programmed to kind of simulate some aspects of the physical environment even before having any experience at all.
So it's pre-training. It's like pre-training.
Yeah. In fact, there are, you can look this up. I mean, some people have even tried to ask, like, what if we put retinal waves into our convolutional neural network? Will it do better? And there's some evidence to say maybe. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So I think we might have time for one more question from the audience before I. Okay, yeah.
Hi. So my name is Diksha. I'm over at the Harvard Kennedy School. So most of us over there are very interested in just rushing to regulate AI. But what I'm interested in is trying to understand what is its potential for social good. So my question is primarily for Alex, but anyone who wants to answer it can answer it. So I'm just trying to understand, given the limitations that we've discussed of AI till now, what do you think, and the future trajectory it's going to have, what do you think is its potential for social good? I know Google is already doing some work, but if you could elaborate more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's enormous potential for social good. I mean, just in terms of being a tool that can make people more productive or just better empowered at what they want to do, I think that there's huge potential there. I would say that I don't think of large language models as necessarily a directional tool, though, in that I feel like it can make people just as efficient at doing bad things as well, right? And so, I think just like, say, the advent of the computer or something like that, right? This is sort of like a new computing mode or a new way of, I guess, communicating at scale that I think has just sort of a ton of different aspects to it, right? And so, in terms of regulation, I guess one of the sort of ideas that I've been forming with some of my colleagues is this idea that, when I was talking about the sort of what I mean paradigm, the definition of a task happens after the large language model has already been served or has already been shipped, right? And so what that means is also that the way that that model touches the world and the kinds of societal implications that it can have ultimately happen after the model has been shipped. So like from a corporate perspective, it's very tempting to say then like, okay, it's not my problem anymore. But obviously, like, you know, you want to have some responsibility for what's happening once that model has been shipped. But I think what that means is that there's like it is a far more of a social problem to figure out sort of how large language models are going to affect society rather than a technical problem. Right, what that means is that the people who are actually doing the technical work need to, you know, try to find the right way to be transparent with the people who are doing the policy and, you know, the social work, and provide the appropriate tools that make it easier to anticipate the impact, the societal impacts of different applications and that sort of thing. But yeah, there really has been this shift, right? As opposed to the cases that we were thinking about before when we thought about societal impacts of machine learning, where it was something like, okay, a bank is going to start using a machine learning model to figure out whether or not to grant you a mortgage, right? In that case, the entire decision was sort of owned by the bank, and so you could think about regulating the bank, and it was very clear sort of what the societal impact would be there. But now the point of decision making and the responsibility defining the task has sort of moved downstream, and so I think that is one thing that's really shifting the conversation a lot.
All right, so I think we're going to wrap up with one final question. And just as a reminder, the title of this workshop is Taking the Big Question Seriously. And one of the biggest questions that comes up a lot is one that I never see thoughtful, non-hysterical discussion on. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to answer this question. We'll start with Marinka, since Sam has had to go first every time. And I'm fully admitting that this is a Lex Friedman kind of question. And a Lex Friedman question is, when you're talking to a serious person, you ask them a question that you would never ask a serious person. So it's about existential risk from AI. We can turn off the recording, Alex. It'll be fine. So there is this idea that we will be surpassed by artificial intelligence in our lifetime. Like there's a non-trivial contingent of people out there who fiercely believe that. So I would like for you to say how seriously you take that claim, if we will have superhuman AI in our lifetime, and if that is something we should be excited or worried about. Marinka.
Okay, great question. So I'm in the camp of Jan LeCun, I would say. So those who know his views probably already kind of get the idea. So generally, I think we already have superhuman intelligence in tools in some way. Like calculators can kind of multiply numbers that are much larger than the numbers that I can multiply in my head, generally speaking. And there are narrowly specialized tools that already outperform human experts in certain disciplines and in certain areas, and it seems like we will get more and more of those kind of tools. But that's not necessarily a problem for that. I think that these tools can be used in a very productive manner to help move the humanity forward. But of course, as with any technology, new technology being developed, it can be used for it can have multiple different uses, and someone can use it for the purpose that it was not initially designed for. And so this is often known as this problem of dual use, that I think it is becoming slightly more challenging nowadays, where on one end, as designers of algorithms, we are trying to make our tools as broadly accessible, as broadly useful, in the spirit of open science work, make sure that we publish papers, publish code bases, tutorials, blog posts, all that. And that is with the goal of narrowing the barriers and of other scientists entering the field and understanding and leveraging the tools that we are developing. But because of that, it also makes it potentially easier for some adversary to leverage and use those tools for the purposes that they were not initially designed for. But this is similar for most or many different kinds of technologies. It is not a phenomenon that is unique to AI. So broadly speaking, I'm less concerned about this.
I guess just to sharpen it slightly.
Okay.
So you control the calculator doesn't control you. Are you ever worried about the relationship between tool and controller of the tool flipping?
Yeah, this reminds me to the New York Times story. The Sydney,
Harvard professor comes out.
the Sydney discussion. I don't know, perhaps if it's like that these tools are in omnipresent sense and we are just not aware of the tool being present in some sense. I don't think we're necessarily at that stage yet. Hopefully not in the near future, where it would be so impossible to discern whether there is or a component or AI component that kind of interacts with us or like it's kind of labeled or influencing us. Because now we know that I talk to ChatGPT, so there's a screen, and now here are some prompts and exchange of communication. So at the end of the day, I can still, no matter what the output is, to say, kind of realize that this is within this environment, which is the virtual environment that kind of is separate from me. Yeah, well, great question.
Okay,
I'll
Alex is on the hot seat.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I guess my standard answer to this is that I am far more worried about the implications of AI long before it becomes superhuman than I am about like the possibility of a superhuman system that also somehow has access to a bunch of different worrisome actions out in the world. I think that kind of scenario seems very far down the line. I could see, potentially like hooking up an AI system to the power grid or something, or giving something like somebody puts a bunch of different systems on the same API system, and then we have another, large language model that's dealing with that, with that set of APIs, and then it figures out that actually, like, oh, if I just modify this query, then I can like access the power grid or something. But so for me, I think that in terms of whether we are controlling the tool or the tool is controlling us, we already see so many different examples of tools controlling people, right? Like whether it is whatever recommendation algorithm is serving you the content on your phone, right? Even like more narrowly, the way that people started structuring Google queries in order to get the search results that they wanted, right? Like there was a series of videos like before, the BERT era, where you could actually like type questions into Google and get reasonable responses, right? It was called If Google Was a Guy, right? And like people would walk into an office, sit across from a desk and be like, diapers size 4 or something, right? And then, expect him to provide responses. And I guess, right, similarly, like prompt engineering, large language models right now is essentially just people sort of bending themselves to the tool, right? So maybe prompt engineering is where, AI is now controlling us. I guess there seems to be this long set of issues that arise first, where I think we would be more worried about things like the use of large language models to scale disinformation, the possibility that people using large language models to query information that they can't validate themselves, leading people to sort of create their own personal echo chambers. That sort of thing feels more worrisome to me, where there's already this interaction between humans and AI systems that I think can have like very large scale impacts, especially as it interacts with other like existential risks that I think are far more tangible, like climate change.
Okay. Sam's looking very pensive over there.
I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I guess where I'm coming from is, why should I worry about existential risk from AI when we're doing just a great job killing ourselves without AI?
I like the common theme of, well, AI is not going to kill us; we're going to kill ourselves. Like,
yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true.
Yeah,
and I mean, I think it's the same. I think you could ask the same question. I had a kid. What would happen if the kid decided to do something terrible, right? It's the same sort of issue, right? I mean, of course, there's lots of other complexities when we're dealing with the AI, but at the end of the day, we're talking about, we put something out there in the world. It could be a person or a machine, and we're trying to teach it to transmit our values culturally to that entity, so that hopefully it does things that are useful and not bad. And it's like having a really smart kid, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, so we can't actually end on that. I lied. So how about we end on a positive note, and we just briefly tell us what about working on AI makes you optimistic about? Like, why are you working on this set of problems given the dual use nature? What gives you cause for hope and cause for optimism?
It's just it's one of the most interesting, compelling intellectual endeavors that's happening now, right? And of course, it can have lots of benefits to humanity, right? But I don't, I think that's what gets me out of bed in the morning is just trying to contemplate these difficult questions.
Yeah, I think let's go.
No, I think like the one thing that's been so inspiring about these about large language models, for example, is that it's providing this far more accessible interface to a lot of the like knowledge and computation than was available before, where now you can ask a question instead of having to go and gather a data set and learn PyTorch or if you're a masochist TensorFlow and then train up some neural networks or something. So I think this sort of democratization of data infrastructure angle to me feels really cool. As long as we can sort of get I guess it's almost like the norms for interacting with these systems stabilize in a positive way.
Cool.
I would just add to that I'm really excited about the positive impact it can have in the context of making medicine more efficient and kind of more comprehensive, making healthcare better and more accessible to a broader range of individuals and worldwide. Just one example of that is how I believe there was a mother of a kid with undiagnosed rare disease. And then after exhausting so many different options that the traditional medicine offered and going to this really long diagnostic odyssey process of being sent from one specialist to the other, that mother finally used ChatGPT to enter a set of symptoms and diagnostic codes and all that information about her kid, and actually produced something meaningful that led to an actual actionable outcome for the child in terms of arriving at the diagnosis and then potentially disease management. And so I think that there are so many exciting opportunities in medicine and biology, scientific discovery at large, that I'm kind of very optimistic for the future of AI.